So we should get started with our next panel on movement resourcing, which we've already heard a lot about funding and money and lack of it. So we're very happy to have this next discussion. And to moderate this discussion, I'm going to invite Russell Roybal to take over the moderation. And he's currently on the board of Outright. He's the Chief External Affairs Officer for the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy. He's been the Deputy Executive Director of the National LGBTIQ Task Force. He's been the Chief Advancement Officer of the San Francisco AIDS Foundation and many, many other things. And I have personally learned so much about fundraising and asking people for money and really how to resource our movements from Russell. So I am super happy that he's able to lead us through this next conversation. Russell, please.
Thank you, Maria. Well, hello.
Hi.
Did everyone have a lovely lunch, I hope, for those here in the room? Well, welcome. Welcome to this session on movement resourcing. As Maria said, I'm Russell Roybal, and I'm delighted to be able to be with you here today. I'm excited about moderating this conversation for a number of reasons, not the least of which is the panel that we have put together for today. But first, the journey for full LGBTIQ rights and equality has far to go in every country, and yet the LGBTIQ movement is severely under-resourced, as we have heard throughout today, especially in the global South. In the last few decades, the LGBTIQ movement has achieved huge progress thanks to the tireless efforts of activists and advocates and the support of donors who have invested in this work. Over the next several years, we know we can rapidly advance human rights and equality for queer, trans, and intersex people globally, depending on how we mobilize right now and involve new friends and allies. So today's panel aims to tackle how funders can help radically accelerate the global LGBTIQ movement, why this is a moment for allies and new funders to invest in this work, and why and how donors who care about human rights, gender equality, equity, and social justice and intersectionality should support queer, trans, and intersex organizations and activists. So I would love to introduce our panel to all of you today. And as they answer questions, they can tell you more about their own work. We're honored to have Ezra Nippon, Senior Program Officer for Knowledge and Learning at the Global Philanthropy Project, and with a snazzy jacket.
Thank you.
I'm also delighted to introduce Jay Gilliam, Senior LGBTQI+ Coordinator at the United States Agency for International Development, USAID.
Yeah.
Welcome. And sitting next to Jay, the Vice President of Programs for the Estrella Lesbian Foundation for Justice, Rebecca Fox. Welcome, Rebecca. And finally, I couldn't be more pleased to introduce my colleague from Outright, Michael Heflin, who is Outright's Global Grants Director. Welcome. It's great to see so many old friends in the audience and meet new ones at this year's Out Summit. So let's go ahead and start our conversation. Let's talk about the landscape and have a quick overview of global funding for LGBTIQ causes, including the progress and gaps. Ezra, do you have some key insights to highlight?
Yeah, thank you. And so grateful to be with you all. And I have some notes so that I can try to be brief and not forget everything. So I'm from Global Philanthropy Project. And for those who are here who might be watching that aren't familiar, we do every 2 years a report called the Global Resources Report that tracks funding flowing to LGBTI communities around the world, and especially focuses on funding to the global South and East. This report breaks out into regional focus to populations within LGBTI and other, co-occurring realities of our lives, donor type, issue, and more. And we have also do focused sub-reports for on specific facets of LGBTI, global, or other regional focused issues. So the most recently we did one focused on funding to Francophone countries. So this data is used by donor governments and development agencies and private and public philanthropy and other kind of funding mechanisms to both identify and to address funding gaps, and also for activists or civil society organizations that are might want to use this report to identify like who are the biggest funders in my region or in my focus area. So it's a resource for that. So there is good news, which is, year over year funding, global queer funding is increasing. Since GPP was founded, the documented funding outside of the US to LGBTI communities went from 35 million in 2010 to 136 million in 2020. So that's like partly a win of our capacity to document, but it's mostly a win of a genuine change, in who's at the table for funding this work. There's more funders, there's more grants, there's a lot more grantees. So the movement and relatedly, the grant making support for the movement is expanding. And there's relatedly an increasing role for intermediary grant makers that receive a big grant and then make a series of smaller grants. So for GPP, some of our members are in this category, including UHI funding mostly in East Africa, the other foundation funding in Southern Africa, the ISDAO in West Africa, and then like other sort of population-focused grant makers like the International Trans Fund, or at Estrella, the Intersex Human Rights Fund is an example. So that's some of the landscape. There's a sobering context too, which is that across the board globally, LGBTI movements are completely underfunded. It's gotten better, but it's bad. In 2019 and 20, we found that under 35 cents out of every $100 of philanthropic money was going to our communities globally. And if we look at, from foundations, if we look at governments, it's less than 4 cents. And the majority of the money that does exist is focused on the USA. So for LGBTI, that's, which is, the USA is about 4% of the world population. For LGBTI funding overall, about 57% went to the USA in the last report. But when we looked at, recently I looked at what is it for trans funding, and it was 70% to the USA. And some regions are especially underfunded. You could just look at it in terms of the amount, but like looking specifically at it in relationship to population, the Asia and the Pacific is about 60% of the world population, and it received about 5% of the LGBTI funding that we're able to document. So that's there's a big gap. Another part of the context is that our opposition is very well funded, as we've been talking about. And in 2020, we analyzed 11 of the top anti-LGBTI organizations and found that just those organizations had received 3 times as much funding as our global movement had. So that's not like their movement versus our, you know what I mean? It's just like 11 organizations, and one of them, one really big one, had the same income as our, or the same expense in the time period we were looking at as our global movement's grant, funding. So, we are facing serious opposition and seriously resourced opposition. I just have a couple more things to say, which is there's a few top donors that make up a very important parts of our movement ecosystem, our funding ecosystem. And so, we just face this reality that like if the winds change, there can be big gaps, and so part of our work is to get all in, more support being held by more supporters. Part of our work is about addressing that there's not focused LGBTI resources within the humanitarian sphere, which is something that we looked at, especially after learning that for most LGBTI organizations, like responding to COVID and some other, recent crises, like the funding is either coming from like out of pocket, we're just all giving each other $10 back and forth, or it's coming from human rights funders that just have pre-existing relationships with groups that are going through crisis. So, how do we move the mechanisms that are made for these kind of emergencies to recognize that our communities have, specific needs in those moments and also are not going to always be served by the existing programs, as people talked about earlier. So, long story short, this panel is well timed for a moment when we need, human rights funders and other adjacent funders more broadly to see this work as, integral, to see like funding frontline queer activists around the world as integral to like every, movement for human rights, for democracy defense, to understand the connections and to be like in with us in this work. So thank you.
Thank you, Ezra. Thanks for that very sobering reality of how our movement is funded. The next question is for Jay and Rebecca. How and why does your organization or institution invest in and support LGBTIQ plus rights and causes? Why is a global focus important? And could you please give some concrete examples of projects or partnerships that you're involved with that you would like to highlight? Let's start with you, Jay.
Great, thank you, Russell. And like you, it's good to see so many familiar faces in the audience, and I'm sure there are a lot of familiar faces online as well. For those of you that don't know USAID, we are the lead US government agency on development and humanitarian issues. And so we have presence in about 100 countries around the world, mostly low and middle income countries, helping them across different development sectors, whether that is in food and agriculture, economic empowerment and inclusion, education, and lots of other development and humanitarian sectors. I want to start with the why we do this, why we do LGBTQI plus inclusion. And first of all, it's because of the president. It's because the president has put a priority on elevating LGBTQ plus issues of inclusion and advancing human rights around the world. And so it's part of our foreign policy with the Biden-Harris administration. And what we are doing at USAID is helping to implement that policy by ensuring that LGBTQI plus inclusion is really part and parcel of the work that we do at USAID. And the second reason why we do it is really because it's smart development. We know that when we include LGBTQI plus persons and others from marginalized communities and groups in vulnerable situations, that we get better development outcomes. That by lifting up and focusing on the most marginalized, that we are really working towards sustainable development outcomes. And so that's the reason why we do it. And we know that there's research that backs up this work. Whether we are looking at, there's been work that's been done in the Caribbean and looking at LGBTQI plus exclusion hindering GDP growth in the region from impacting 2 to 5% of GDP growth because of LGBTQI plus exclusion. And that can be accounted for in brain drain, it can be accounted for in health disparities, and amongst a lot of other things. We also know that when there's LGBTQI plus inclusions, that democracies are thriving and stronger. And so democracies are responding to people's lives and their needs. And when we see LGBTQI plus inclusion, we know that democracies are stronger. And democracy strengthening and advancing democracy is part and parcel of the work that we are doing at USAID. And so there's a really strong and clear connection there. Just in terms of how we do this work, this past summer at USAID, we launched our LGBTQI plus inclusive development policy. And this policy really reiterates our commitment to advancing LGBTQI+ inclusion and advancing human rights for LGBTQI+ persons around the world. And it really just serves as a blueprint for how we want to work to integrate it across the development sectors and humanitarian spaces that we work in at USAID. And I'll say that we have this policy, but it's not the first time that we've been working on LGBTQI+ inclusion at USAID. We've actually been doing this work over many decades, starting with combating the HIV and AIDS epidemic through our work in being one of the government agencies that implements PEPFAR. We've been working with LGBTQI+ groups advancing human rights needs around the world. But now we have this policy that adds an additional framework for us to think about advancing LGBTQI+ inclusion through development, through a development lens. And I think that's really exciting for us because it, as we are talking about resources, opens up a new area of resources that we can start looking into to address the needs and challenges of LGBTQI+ communities around the world. And then just maybe one concrete example of how we've been doing this work. We have a number of public-private partnerships that we are doing to advance LGBTQI+ inclusion. It first started in 2014 when we partnered with Australia Lesbian Foundation in our first public-private partnership on LGBTQI+ inclusion. And at the moment, we have two public-private partnerships, one again with Australia, and then another one with Outright. And these partnerships really allow us to coordinate with other donors. We've been really grateful to have other government donors as part of these partnerships, whether that's Sweden CETA or Global Affairs Canada, as well as other private philanthropic partners. It allows us to coordinate with donors through these partnerships. It also allows us to work and utilize the expertise of Outright and Australia to utilize their network and connecting with grassroots organizations on the ground to be able to sub-grant down where we know it might be really difficult and challenging for LGBTQI+ groups to partner with a government agency like USAID. So we've been really excited that these partnerships have been part of the way that we are working to advance LGBTQI+ inclusion. And I'll just say for our partnership with Australia, it's now in its fourth year, the Multi-Donor Global Human Rights Initiative. And we've been really excited that within those 4 years that we've supported 225 local LGBTQI+ groups around the world. And so that is just a really concrete example of the way that we're trying to support local LGBTQI+ groups, acknowledging sometimes the difficulty and challenges of working with the government donor. With that, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jay. Rebecca, same question to you, but I was wondering also if you could highlight Estrella's work around intersex communities.
Sure.
Because that was a topic that came up earlier today, and I think that deserves a lot more attention.
Absolutely. So talk a little bit about Estrella. We've been around since 1977, and one of my favorite things is that if you look at the picture of our founding mothers, a group of multiracial, multicultural, multi-generational lesbians sitting around a table in New York, you will notice that lesbian fashion has not changed. That is literally the sweater vest sweaters of today, and it still works. So yay for us. And I think some of the most important work that we do is in partnership with USAID and DRL. And what it has meant for us is the ability to make those grants, but also to increase our reach as an institution. So we went from having like 2 program officers, one for the US, one for international, to now having 12 different program officers all around the globe. And Estrella holds 3 distinct funds: the US fund, the international fund, and the Intersex Human Rights Fund. And one of our roles is as an incubator. So IHRF sits at Estrella. It's been there now since 2018. But eventually, just like the ITF did, we used to incubate them, it will roll off and become its own organization. So what we do is to help these funds build the capacity they need to be functional on their own. And IHRF holds a very unique role. It is by and for intersex people. It has an advisory board. So while Estrella helps with all of the kind of background work, we actually don't make the grant-making decisions. The program officers and advisory board do. And I think this can't be overstated in the international context. It provides a space for people to come together. So right before COVID hit, and actually one of I was at my last job, a donor to IHRF, and I remember sitting in the office and saying to my boss in, what was it, like February of 2020, I just don't know if I should be flying to Thailand right now for this intersex meeting, right, when we thought we had choices. So what we do is to not only make those grants that, and oftentimes we are their only donor or definitely their first donor, but we also help intersex activists to come together, to learn from each other, and most importantly, to feel less lonely. In many regions or countries, it is one or two brave people who are out there as the face of the intersex movement, and they are deeply isolated. They are sometimes ostracized from their community or family. They have friends, but those friends may be scared to come out. So holding a convening space, like we are doing with the support of USAID and in partnership with ILGA, allows them to be in those spaces. And I think what's important about IHRF and many of our grantees is that while we are the first donor, our greatest hope is that our groups grow so big that they can no longer receive funds from us. So groups like Interact, Intersex Europe, OIA Australia, they start off as Australia grantees, and eventually they start getting money directly from our donors, and they stop getting money from us. And that to us is one of the strongest signs of strength. And for all of our grantees, including the intersex ones, these organizations are not just doing the policy and advocacy work, they're also providing beds for people to sleep in, safe houses, funds for people to continue going to school once their parents have kicked them out. They provide all the services, and they're doing it for very, very little money, and they're doing it with a real lack of safety to themselves. So I'm just going to mention a couple of groups today. And the first one I'm going to talk about is Where, which is out of Nigeria. And this is run by just a badass human being, a badass lesbian. And what they provide is safe housing, an emergency hotline for people who need funds. Their number one request is for girls who have come out as queer, losing their ability to have school fees from their parents. So their number one request is, can you help me finish high school? And the answer almost always is yes. At the same time, they have also created a model of supporting lesbian and queer-owned businesses that has led to the creation of 70 different organizations in Nigeria that are led by queer women that provide real income from them. And when you meet with this group, they say, yes, it's about that individual having that money, but it's actually about the fact that they now have respect and power in their family, right? So it's not just the funds to survive, it's the ability to reform community. I'm gonna talk about one more group, and then I'm talking about two more groups. I'll also say that we have groups like A Spicy Nipples in Puerto Rico, and I'm bringing them up not only because they have an amazing name, right? If you work with queer orgs, you're always gonna get a couple amazing names, but also because they speak to those groups who exist kind of in the in-between space. Are they in our US portfolio? Are they in our Caribbean portfolio? What does that look like to hold groups who exist in many spaces, either because of colonization or migration, that they cannot just claim one land as their own? And this is a group in Puerto Rico that is working on climate justice. They're teaching queer people how to rebuild their houses after hurricanes hit. They're buying up land so they don't get pushed out by gentrification. And they're pushing for rights for people in Puerto Rico. So it's not a one-off, it's all of it. And you're talking about a 3-person organization. And the last piece that I'll mention is our funds, particularly the ones from USAID, have allowed us to partner with other organizations. So we have a strong partnership with Urgent Action Funds, which, if you don't know them, they help human rights defenders who are no longer safe at home either move permanently or temporarily to other cities or countries where they will be safer. And we have been able to partner with them and move funds with them to increase the amount of work that they are doing, particularly around intersex activists. And these are the kinds of partnerships that, working together, their strength is emergency response. That is not our strength. We are not set up for that. Our strength is LGBTQI organizing. Let's give them some money and work together in partnership so that we can help keep people safer.
Thank you, Rebecca. And thank you for that color commentary on lesbian fashion.
Always.
It's timeless. Michael, now to you. Why and how is Outright expanding its grant making What are some of the key priorities, and what kinds of insights are you hearing from grantee partners?
Thank you, Russell. It's great to be part of this panel in my still relatively new role as the Global Grants Director at Outright International. Many of you know me. It's great to see you but you know me from my time at Open Society Foundations, or even a few of you back to my time at Amnesty International. But it's great to be in this role at Outright. And also just to say, it's really nice to be on this panel with Ezra, Jay, and Rebecca. All three of them have really played important roles in mobilizing more resources for the LGBTQI communities around the world, and continuing to play that role. So it's great to be here and working in collaboration with them. So as your questions mentioned, Outright is relatively new to the role of grant maker, or at least an expanded role as grant maker. And we are new, and we're really hoping to learn from the experience of the core members of the Global Philanthropy Project, others who have been funding in this space for a long time. And alongside our learning, we're hoping that we also can participate and facilitate opportunities for sharing and learning from other donors, as well as we continue to expand our own role. I also want to underscore that even as we expand our role as a grant maker, we're very much committed at Outright to the work that Outright is known for doing. So the leadership role that Outright has played in doing advocacy at the United Nations and creating platforms for LGBTQI groups around the world to access the United Nations, other global forums to speak to and advance LGBTQI rights, and to leverage those spaces to support their domestic advocacy. So all that work is going to continue, and in fact, we're doubling down on that work. Additionally, we've been, as you've heard throughout today, we've expanded our own programming directly focused on some of the most marginalized or groups that have historically faced the greatest discrimination within our communities, including more programming around LBQ rights, more programming around trans and intersex rights. So all of that work is going to continue, is going to expand. But, and we've been working again with groups on the ground in a hands-on way, providing technical support around advocacy and research and all of those things. And those things will continue. But, one thing that we hear from groups all around the world that we work with is, at the end of the day, all of that support is needed, but, they need resources in order to be able to move forward the work. And as Ezra explained, there has been some growth in resources, but, I'm really here, and I'm, here at Outright because I know that there's really a dearth of resources still as compared to the needs and opportunities that are out there. So at Outright, we're really committed to doing our part, and we've really come to the conclusion that we have to do our part to both expand and make sure that those resources are distributed to all the different parts of our umbrella community, all the different geographies around the world. So we're really committed to doing our part to mobilize more resources and mobilize more resources from different sources. So, again, there has been some growth in donors who have supported this work, including growth in terms of the US government support for this work, some other governments. But again, the need is so much greater than the resources that are out there. And it's, we're really interested in engaging new donors. And so not focusing on the same small set of donors that we're all, competing for resources from, but to grow the donor pool. And that will include, traditional philanthropy, so getting more foundations interested in supporting LGBTQI rights work. It'll include individual donors, individual major donors, also include corporations, something that we were able to mobilize in connection to our COVID response emergency fund and to our Ukraine emergency response fund and other programs that we've been doing. And so we feel like there's a real potential to mobilize new resources for the field. And I guess, just to say again why we're really doing this, again, it's the need, but also the consequences are significant. Again, as we've heard today, the backlash that we are seeing here in this country is really a global backlash. And the consequences, if we don't adequately respond to that backlash, are really dire for LGBTQI rights. We've already seen in many places around the world that there's been a stall in terms of being able to continue to make progress on LGBTQI rights. Some places are beginning to go backwards. We're seeing, regressive laws. We spoke earlier today about what just happened in Russia last week, where the Supreme Court declared the global LGBTQI movement to be terrorist or extremist a movement. We saw, of course, laws like the law that was passed in Uganda earlier this year. So we know that the consequences for our communities around the world are potentially dire if we don't mobilize the resources to respond adequately. At the same time, I think it's important to underscore that there's also lots of opportunities, that in many places around the world, we are still making progress, even with the headwinds that we're facing. So if we just use an example of Africa, of course, we know about Uganda, but in the last 10 years, more countries have, just using decriminalization as one example, have decriminalized consensual homosexual conduct than have criminalized or further criminalized. So countries like Mozambique and Angola, Botswana, just to name a few, most recently Mauritius, that have decriminalized. And so, we are seeing progress. We talked earlier today again about intersex rights, where a number of countries, particularly in Europe, have now, the laws are not necessarily perfect, but they've placed restrictions on unnecessary surgeries or prohibited unnecessary surgeries. So there's been real progress around legal gender recognition, other issues. So there is potential to make progress. There are creative activists around the world who, if they get the resources in their hands, know how to defend their rights, know how to build intersectional coalitions, work in collaboration with others, and make real progress. But that's not going to happen unless we mobilize the resources. But we do believe that if we're capable of doing that, if we succeed at doing that, we can radically accelerate the process of social and legal change. And that's something that can happen. But again, it's only going to happen if we're able to mobilize the resources and match those resources with creative initiatives and activists around the world who are leading this work.
Thank you, Michael. I was just at a donor organizing conference in San Juan last week, and the message is that we need to move billions more resources. It's not about splitting one pie, it's about baking many more pies. And as Ezra said, not passing around the same amount of money to groups, but really finding new sources of funding. Jay, let's go back to you and talk about how at USAID, how does funding LGBTIQ work intersect with and complement USAID's other priorities like women's rights, gender equality, human rights, advancing democracy, et cetera?
Sure, great. Well, I talked a little bit earlier around the intersecting work at USAID between LGBTQI+ issues and HIV and AIDS, as well as human rights work. I think another way that we are trying to make sure we are seizing the priorities that are current at the agency is through supporting research that connects to those priorities. So for example, we have supported research in making connections between LGBTQI+ inclusion and democracy. What I talked about earlier in terms of the stats that inclusive democracies are more LGBTQI+ inclusive, and the strength of democracies really hinder on how those places really show their respect for LGBTQI+ persons and their issues and needs. A lot of that research has been supported through the multi-donor Global Human Rights Initiative that we have with Estrella through our partners at Williams Institute and Franklin and Marshall College in Pennsylvania. And so they're able to give us the data that really shows why there's a strong connection with LGBTQI+ issues and democracy strengthening, so that we can more easily work with our democracy and governance colleagues in showing this is the way that we can connect these issues and provide funding and engage LGBTQI+ communities as we are supporting democracy strengthening programs. Another area that is a priority and one that we've been able to utilize research to connect with is with our gender colleagues and the work that the agency is doing around gender-based violence. And so we have a partnership with the UK's FCDO called What Works 2.0, which is really trying to expand the evidence base of gender-based violence, particularly around LGBTQI plus persons, and trying to look at the ways that we can prevent it, that we can understand the real causes behind it, and that we can mitigate it for LGBTQI plus persons. And so with this research that, again, gives us the evidence to work with our gender colleagues that are working on gender-based violence to talk about what are some actual programs and activities that we could be creating to address the needs, particularly around gender-based violence for LGBTQI plus communities. Another priority at USAID is around localization. And so over the past 2 years, the agency has really made an effort to put local partners and actors at the forefront of the work that we're doing, being able to shift resources to more local partners, being able to put them in the lead for the work that we're doing. And we know that working with local LGBTQI plus communities is the best way that we are going to help understand the needs and priorities of communities, as well as being able to resource them and support them in advancing those needs and priorities. And so in our LGBTQI plus inclusive development policy, we reference localization and the need to really accelerate localization efforts writ large at the agency, because we know that they will have a disproportionately positive impact on the work that we are doing with LGBTQI plus communities. And then lastly, I'll just share that integration is also a really big part of the work that we're doing at USAID. And again, similar to research and the support that we have in the research space, if we can find ways to support integration in education, in economic empowerment and inclusion, and align with those other priorities of the agency with LGBTQI plus issues, we're working again to expand the pie of resources and support that is available. I'll just note, we've worked really hard over the past couple of years to show that integration in USAID policies. So not only do we have the LGBTQI plus inclusive development policy, but we have policies from gender and women's empowerment to anti-corruption to our youth policies that mention and integrate LGBTQI plus issues in those policies. And that is a signal for all of our staff, as well as our partners in the field, to say these issues are also LGBTQI plus issues, and again, make it easier to connect and work with our partners and our staff around the world on LGBTQI plus inclusion.
Thanks, Jay. Ezra, what do you want funders who want to know, who want to invest in LGBTIQ communities, what do you want them to know?
Well, the main thing I want them to know is that Global Philanthropy Project is just a big resource for, a group that has a grant maker that has one LGBTI grant in their portfolio and wants to learn more and understand how to be strategic, an organization that's considering taking on a more strategic program area, like the wide range of levels of engagement that, there's this community of practice for informed and often, working in tandem, coordinated action. You could be independent action, but it could also be informed, coordinated action. And we have a great data set to help funders understand the gaps and opportunities and many opportunities for co-learning and co-strategizing and ways to leverage what support your your institution is able to offer to be of broader strategic impact and just informed and effective. So the first thing I want grant makers or potential grant makers to know is there's a team for you, and so don't get in. We want everyone all in, and there's a lot of resources. Also, that there's in the next few years, there's going to be increasingly a lot more data about what are the civil society movement needs. There's a big project that's going to be about 3 years running, called LGBTI Pathways Project, that GPP and ILGO World have launched, and then I think there's many other sort of related pieces of research that are going to be tracking civil society needs assessment at regional levels, and then also being able to cross match that with what's happening in the funding to say, oh, like, you know, this community says they really need this, and this is what the donors are doing. Like, we need a adjustment, you know. So we're gonna we have some of that now. We're gonna have a lot more in the next few years. So this is like our ability to do increasingly specific analysis of where the gaps are, and to leverage that to fill them is just about to deepen very much. Another thing I want to say is, you know, the opposition is well organized, as we talked about, but like we are too, and we are moving big resources to defend LGBTI movements and feminist movements and all of those that are sort of under shared attack. And we often in these conversations are saying, like, we need to not be stuck in our silos. And I want to be like, we are not stuck in our silos in this conversation. Like, we are in conversation with each other across world regions, across issue areas. We could get less in our silos still, but like we are in broad network and solidarity and movement together. And that organizing is happening. If you're not in it, like, get in, because it is needed. We need more of it. And we are, but there's powerful organizing happening in this philanthropic sector to do that work. I want to say there's a couple of examples of this, the impact of this recent work. One is that in the last Global Resources Report, GPP's focus is on moving money to the global South and East, and there was a $10 million increase from the last report in this most recent report, which is, you know, we need a lot more, but that's an impact of a lot of organizing. And another thing is that the Australian government just announced a groundbreaking new fund to fund LGBTI communities in Asia and the Pacific with a first investment of $3.5 million. That's again a result of a lot of different, you know, civil society and philanthropic organizing. And then just a few days ago, there was an announcement of a multi-donor fund that includes the UK government that was launched, called Equal, Safe and Free, that is going to distribute 25 million pounds over the next 4 years in sub-Saharan Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific Islands. And then in the like more foundation field, I think another inspiring thing is the Nebula Fund, which is pooled resources from 8 private funds to support movements for gender justice and LGBTI rights to expand narrative power. So, you know, I'll briefly just sum up to say, like, you know, our movements are around the world are under sustained attack and wildly underfunded, and also are like consistently building better worlds for ourselves and each other, and are, you know, to meet each other's needs as queers, you know, and to try to build better, safer, more joyful, more prideful space. And you know, we are, you know, like, against all odds, we actually are winning, and we are finding pleasure, and we're supporting each other. We're doing this. And so, you know, we talked about the lack of funding equity. It's like, imagine what it would be like. Imagine a world where it wasn't a $10 million increase. It was $100 million, or the billions you're talking about. I mean, what could the movements that are so powerful with such little resources and such sustained attack, like, imagine the change that we would see with the increase. So thank you.
Yes, let's talk about abundance. Rebecca, are there any big opportunities or threats that you see as pivotal to fund right now?
So I think I'll start with the negative, move to the positive. And I think one thing to keep in mind is that the same way that Ezra is talking about, like, how we're an intersectional movement, many things that the opposition puts in place to squash civil society has an outsized impact on us. So if you look at countries like India that are passing foreign interference laws, what that means is that it's increasingly difficult to get money into those countries, right? And you're talking about many places where there's not the same, frankly, tax write-off for giving money. So you don't have as much internal giving. And a lot of these groups depend almost solely on money from outside their borders. And that means it costs more money and it's much, much more difficult to move money. And what that means is that our grants management team is constantly have to figure out new ways of getting resources in. And actually at the GPP meeting that we were at in Mauritius, there was a whole conversation about giving people autonomous credit cards, using things like Western Union. Things that really would have been unheard of a decade ago are now the necessity that it means to be able to trust people to move forward with this work. Also passing things like laws against fiscal sponsorship. So for a lot of small groups that are not able to register in their home country, they will partner up with a larger, sometimes more mainstream civil rights group in order to get money to them. And more and more countries are cracking down on this and saying that can't exist, leaving them no ways of receiving funds or no ways of organizing safely. And then in particular for our movement, you cannot overstate how dangerous the anti-gender ideology work is. They are coming for us. They are splitting our movement. They are splitting the feminist movement. They are doing that all to their advantage and our disadvantage. And we oftentimes hold the United States as a separate country, but really it's the exact same thing that is happening in the South and Midwest of this country, and laws prohibiting trans people from accessing medicine or playing on sports teams. It is just done very smartly for each country's context. All of that is terrible and scary. And the positive is that we see an increasing wave of young people saying, like, I don't understand why y'all are homophobic. They literally cannot grasp why people care to police other people's gender, sexuality, and love in this way. And what statistic after statistic shows us is that people under the age of 25 are, including people who identify as evangelical, highly conservative, highly religious, that are all also incredibly supportive of queer, trans, and intersex rights. So we can see that new wave coming, which is why we see the opposition building too. They are scared of the next pieces. And for Estrella, I'm just going to talk a little bit about our name, the Estrella Lesbian Foundation for Justice. It is a live conversation about why we keep the word lesbian in our name. And we have determined that it is both important for us as both a feminist fund, as a way of recognizing the continued contributions of women in this movement, and as a direct pushback against the turfism and anti-gender ideology that you see growing in women's space. We are a lesbian organization. We are 15 steps above trans inclusive. We are a fully trans organization. We are a fully intersex organization. And we are unwilling to be split by the opposition because it is both morally wrong, but also because it's a really losing strategy. Our strength is in our solidarity, and that is the thing that scares them above all else.
Rebecca, can you quickly tell folks in case
I'm going to applause them.
they aren't familiar with the acronym what TERF is?
Oh, trans exclusive radical feminism. And I always have a hard time saying that feminism in that word, but that is the way that we identify them. Thank you.
Welcome. That could be a whole panel.
A whole rant.
Michael, you wanted to chime in on this question too.
Yeah, I know we're down to less than 15 minutes, so maybe just a couple of thoughts. One is, when there's the kind of challenge that we're experiencing globally, and maybe it's wrong to say it creates an opportunity, because I don't want to kind of minimalize the impact that backlash is having to people around the world, that there are real negative consequences. We see increased violence. We see, young people who are questioning their sexuality or their gender identity, who are, impacted negatively by the discourse that we're seeing. So those consequences are real. But I also think that it is true that almost everywhere around the world, our issues and our communities are more visible than they have ever been. And in part, there's a kind of negative visibility at the moment. But that also creates space for opportunity. That creates a space, if we have the right kinds of resources, if we can bring to the table communications experts, if we can develop campaigning strategies, we can shift that narrative. But we need resources to be able to do that. And the fact that we're visible, again, creates the possibility to mobilize resources to respond to those negative kinds of attacks that we're seeing around the world. So I think that's important. I also just want to echo, I think part of what Jay was saying and others is that there's different ways of reframing our issues. Like if we think about the challenge that democracies all around the world are facing, that our community is one of the communities that's being used, weaponized, to attack our communities and to attack other marginalized groups, but using that to undermine the very institutions of democracy. So becoming part of a broader effort to protect and expand inclusive democracy is a way that I think we can support our work in a new way. Similarly, inclusive development is also another frame, economic justice and inclusive development. So these are different frames that we can use, I think, that will help us connect with additional resources and help to better respond to the kinds of challenges that we see around the world.
As we are getting ready to move to questions, the last question I have for all of you, or just a couple of you since we have a little bit of time left, is, we've talked about that. I think I've heard each of you say that many things encompass what is a queer, trans, or intersex issue. Building houses in Puerto Rico, queering the humanitarian response that Outright does. But what would you say to other funders who are thinking about, who are listening, and who are trying to decide if they should prioritize LGBTIQ causes and partners? What would you say to them? Rebecca, why don't we start with you?
I like that, I'll always be ready to talk. That if you're serving people, you're already serving queer, trans, and intersex people. It's just whether or not you're doing it well, right? So if you are working in health, if you're working in climate justice, no matter what topic you are working on, you are 100% serving queer, trans, and intersex people. You are supporting queer, trans, and intersex-led organizing. You just don't know it, and that means you're not supporting them as well as you can be. So to me, the question is doing it with intention and thought versus willful ignorance that it's happening.
One more? Somebody else want to respond to that before we take a question? Michael?
Yeah, so I would say I would totally agree with Rebecca, but I'd also say it the other way around, which is, when we think about those larger frames, climate change, think about the threats to democracy, we are disproportionately impacted. Our communities are weaponized, are used to advance policies that undermine democratic institutions altogether. But we're also part of the solution. We're a creative community. If our community can be engaged and mobilized, we can be, and in many places we are at the forefront already of advancing progressive policies around climate change, of protecting democratic institutions. So we're an important community to invest in because we can be, again, part of the change and the response to those challenges.
Thank you. Questions? Are there questions?
Sorry,
Go ahead, Jay. Sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one more to what Michael and Rebecca said. And I think I would say for folks to not be scared to engage with LGBTQI+ groups. I think for so long we've been upholding the principle of do no harm. But for my conversations with a lot of funders, with a lot of partners, is that oftentimes that gets them to be scared and they do nothing. And so I think in terms of engaging with LGBTQI+ folks, we have to uphold that principle, but also know that there's a lot of harm to be done when there's inaction. And so making sure that as we are doing this work, we are really strategically and thoughtfully engaging with LGBTQI+ groups because they are best suited to understand what risk they are willing to take and asking us to help take on some of that risk to support them.
Thank you, Jay. Do we have a question in the chat? Yeah. Yes. So we'll take a couple of questions and then we'll get to the panelists. Go ahead.
Okay, so Renee from Barbados. Thank you. Renee from Barbados comments, registered civil society organizations, especially in the Global South, need funding that helps them to maintain their office and pay staff. Funding projects is great, but organizations struggle to execute these projects when they can't keep their office door open and staff to run and report on these projects.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, Celeste Smith, Global Philanthropy Project. I promise I'm not a plant. So my question is related to that, specifically for Jay and Michael. We heard about intersex groups that have 1 to 2 staff members in their office, and obviously you all make larger grants that those organizations don't have the capacity to absorb. So in what ways can funders who want to fund these smaller organizations help build the capacity of potential grantees? And then question for Ezra, what other research is in the GPP pipeline?
And
That was a
one more question here, and then we'll get to the panelists.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Samantha DeComans, pronouns she, her, hers. I'm from the National Democratic Institute's Equal Rights in Action Fund. My question's for Ezra. I'm wondering if you can share some of the key findings of the report that you produced with AGID on the of resources available for Francophone organizations, particularly from governments, and how those sort of grant-making mechanisms that exist with governments in Francophone countries might differ from those available in Hispanophone and Anglophone countries.
All right, let's get to the answer to some of these questions because we are running out of time quickly. The first couple of questions were really about overhead and not just project-based support, but really funding what it takes for an organization to exist.
I'll just start to acknowledge that that is an issue with U.S. government funding, and particularly USAID funding, moving from project to more core support. I think through our public-private partnerships, we've been able to work with Estrella, work with Outright to make sure that there is core support for organizations. I also know that that's part of the localization agenda, knowing that as we work with smaller, more local partners, that core support is going to be key to a successful local systems approach to the work we do.
And Rebecca, when you fund, the second question was about folks who don't have the capacity to absorb a large grant. How do you handle that?
So part of the job of Estrella is to take the money from USAID and other places that have very stringent requirements because it is government money, and to mix and match that with general operating support that we get from private foundations so that groups are able to both do the project work but also able to literally keep the lights on. And it takes, we have a team of 5 people whose whole job is to do that mixing and matching. And that's why for us it's important to have money coming from all of the different pieces. And I'll also say that we really believe, every minute a group is spending writing a report to us, that's a minute they're not doing the work that is keeping people alive. So for us, it's also about how do we have low touch reporting? How are we collecting the information we need to keep the money coming in? And no more than that, right? So like doing the evaluation, making sure it's working, but also being really clear about what matters. And that is the work that our groups are holding up.
Thank you. Ezra, the questions about other research available, and then that specific question about that report.
I'll just say briefly, there's just one more week left of a survey about trans and intersex organizing. This is the 3rd edition, and that is going to be coming out around September as a piece of knowledge that will be used very actively for advocacy to increase the funding to civil society, trans and intersex global movements. So if you know or are part of a trans or intersex focused group, let's make sure that they take the survey. And we're also doing research about philanthropic responses to the anti-gender movement. That's going to be coming out, as well as the Global Resources Report. So there's a lot in the pipeline, and I mentioned the LGBTI Pathways Project, which is a much longer term. I'll just say about the Francophone, I don't have a lot of it off the top of my head, to be honest, but I think we're going to post the link to the report for groups that are online, and maybe we can share it out afterwards too. And just to say the big number is that only 1% of global LGBTI funding is going to Francophone countries. And there is a number of Francophone countries that no dollars, and that report is in US dollars. No funding was reported to. So, it's the first time we've looked at that question, and it's a big call to action about a way of looking at how money is moving. Thank you.
Richa, I think we have time for one last question.
The fact that you have asked LGBT groups to be together, it's very difficult because we know that many LGBT groups are also right-wing, especially I'm coming from India, and we cannot be organized because we cannot be organized with right-wing groups. And those right-wing groups, because they are big in number, are getting the largest number of funds. And as LBQ groups, we know that 40% of LBQ groups are getting only 5,000 annual money, which is really less. And this is one thing. And the second thing is that as LBQ groups are actually living a life of threats and violence and also getting funding only from feminist groups like Astria, Mama Cash, or women's funds, the money is very, very little. And so how do we negotiate this balance? And secondly, just the division of money that funders get versus the money that fundies get is very, very, very unbalanced. The kind of work that the ground level needs is huge, but because you are getting us the money, does it make you is it right that you get the money that you get, and is it right that we get the money we get? And as LBQ groups, we do not get multi-level multi-year grant. We have to apply every year to get that money, and therefore the intersectional work that we do, the intersectional progressive work that we do is not recognized, because even though I'm the director, I do clerical work, I do social media, I do running around, I do bank work, because we do not have money to show the kind of work we do, which bigger organizations, which are also right-wing, can do. And therefore bigger organizations keep on getting money, which we LBQ groups do not get money. And this is a very sad thing that's happening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ritu. Michael, and then we'll wrap up.
Yes, so I'll start, and maybe Rebecca wants to add something to this too, or others. But I know at Outright, as we've developed our grant-making programs, we have developed programming to specifically speak to specific constituencies that have been left out of the funding to date. So there's a program called LBQ Connect. We've started with our trans program to do some trans-specific grants. Hopefully we'll be able to do intersex grants going forward in the future. But there's a real commitment, there's an understanding that certain parts of the community have missed out on funding opportunities. And while there's a need to expand overall funding, we also need to make sure that we're addressing the needs again of those and centering those who have faced the greatest stigma and greatest marginalization. So that's something we're committed to, and it's something, as we push for more resources, something that we'll also be working to try to mobilize resources to address the needs of those communities. Also, just to say that we see the grant making as a part of our accompaniment or support for groups overall. So it comes along with technical support, so providing capacity building support that gets organizations to a place where they are able to access funding from other donors in the long run. So that's very much a part of. So the grant making is not happening in a silo or separate aside from the overall work that Outright is doing to support groups in the movement overall, that it's part of that larger package of support.
Give a quick comment.
I just want to add and to respond a little bit of, there's this whole belief in funder land around like the percentage of a percentage of money and how much an organization can absorb. And I really find that to be a huge fallacy, right? It is oftentimes like at my last job in private philanthropy, we couldn't be more than a quarter or a third of an organization's budget. And what that does for smaller groups is keep them in a perpetual cycle of poverty and constantly struggling. At Estrella, we very purposely have no limit. We're often 100% of an organization's budget, and we don't make that larger grants, and that's a problem, right? So I think a lot of times people are like, well, this group's gonna be dependent on me, that group's gonna be dependent on me. This whole cycle is one of dependency, right? Large groups like Outright and Estrella, we can't afford to lose grants either. So if you're looking at an organization, if you're thinking about giving and you're like, I have $10,000 to give, they only do $5,000 worth of work, I guarantee you that first of all, are doing $400,000 worth of work. It's all in kind and it's all the labor of the individuals, and that organizations are able to absorb far more than they actually receive.
Thank you for that comment to close on, Rebecca. I want to thank Michael, Rebecca, Jay, and Ezra for being on the panel today. Folks, we'll probably be around for a bit if you want to get some one-on-one time or ask some additional questions. And I want to thank all of you, both online and here in the room, for participating. It's been my pleasure to be with these amazing folks.
Thank you, Russell.
And
Thanks.
Yay,
Of course.
thank you.